Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. And folks, I am back. I am back as chaos reigns on the streets, dear listeners. Really the psychic streets. You know, I walk outside, perfectly pleasant outside. I can walk Mabel and I'm not accosted by freaks like it's Escape from LA or anything like that. But as chaos reigns on the psychic streets of America, I am back to soothe your souls with an hour of existential talk with the artists I love. I took a hiatus for a few weeks. I had to finish some pitches and scripts that I had been promising people. Because let me tell you, dear listener, it is so much easier to edit a podcast, to write an email to someone, to see if they'd be on a podcast, to record, the easiest of all, to have a wonderful conversation with someone, that it is to rewrite, to do a second draft of a 55-page script. But I did the mature thing. I took a break. But now I'm back, and what an episode today. This is Colin Meloy. Absolute delight. If you don't know who Colin is, I will read you his bio right now. Originally from Helena, Montana, musician Colin Meloy played in a few bands in high school and college before eventually forming the Decemberists in Portland, Oregon at the turn of the century. They released their first album, Castaways and Cutouts, a few years later on Kill Rock Stars, who they continued to work with until eventually signing with Capitol Records. Since 2002, the band has released 9 albums, and in addition, Colin has recorded a number of solo cover albums, starting with Colin Meloy Sings Morrissey almost 2 decades ago. By the way, probably the best way to listen to Morrissey these days is to listen to other people cover him. Because hearing Morrissey kind of brings up all the awful things that Morrissey himself has said. Anyway, the Decemberists' latest album, As It Ever Was, So It Will Be Again, was just released in mid-June on Yab Records, and like everything else the band does, it is great. Highly recommended, folks. This was a real joy. I didn't know what to expect. And guess what? Colin's a lovely person to chat with. We get into it. We get into Montana. We get into parents. We get into grandparents. We get into great uncles, folks. That's right, the thrum of history, the force of the past bearing down, and how that figures into the existential decisions one makes. Colin and I get into it. I hope you enjoy it, and folks, stick around. Stick around, because in the next few weeks, I got some great episodes. Next week, Doug Henwood. If you don't know who Doug is, wonderful political writer. Wrote a great book on Wall Street, a fantastic article on the ruling class in Jacobin that I think you can find online. We talk about how his experiences going to Yale influence his politics, his left politics, and also I've got a ton of episodes with kind of rising musicians. Rising? Sure, we'll go with that. Asher White, great talk. Mabi Frati, who's a Guatemalan cellist, whose new album I love. So stay tuned for all of this. But for now, let's talk to Colin. I was reading about your childhood last night, and it seems almost like a fait accompli that you would do something artistic. And I guess I will just be overt and say that is what I'm curious to figure out. Like, how much of an existential choice did you make? And I'm not asking you directly, but I'm just saying, like, that's kind of what I'm curious about when I was reading about. Because if I can remember correctly, your aunt is a writer. Your great uncle was a painter. Your sister's a writer. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a lot of that floating around.
Yeah. So I grew up in a family in Helena, Montana, the capital city of Montana, but still pretty small. You know, it's that probably back then, you know, it was like 20,000 people or something like that. Pretty small. And the Meloys are like a third generation Montana family. Right. Well, no, but I think my grandfather's grandfather came up from, so it goes way back. Came to the Townsend area and settled there. And so we've always been kind of in that area, the Meloys. In that immediate family, my grandfather's brother was a painter who taught at Columbia, and he kind of made his living doing portraits. He was and book illustrations, and then taught at Columbia and kind of moved out of like watercolor to like in the 40s and in the 40s started doing more abstract expressionist stuff. And I think that, but then my grandfather was a potter, and they would collaborate on pottery together. My grandfather would throw the pots, and my great uncle, his brother, would paint them and do the and they experimented on glazing together. And they were kind of instrumental in starting the Archie Bray, which is a pottery center, like residency, I guess you might call it, studio, just kind of a whole campus there in Helena, which is the Archie Bray Center for Ceramic Arts.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Do you think your grandfather, was it more of an artisan type thing, or do you think he was experimenting in how to do pottery?
No, I think they were experimenting. Though, I mean, I think it was utilitarian too. I mean, all of the plates that I grew up eating on. God, my cat. Speaking, I see you have a cat. Just like scratching at the door. Okay, so so it was very utilitarian. They're meant to be eaten on, even though they look like, decorative art a little bit because of my great uncle. Well, also I think they both had a similar style when they would do glazing and painting on the pots and the plates and things.
When you're a kid and you're eating off of artwork, I'm just trying to imagine, we have like there are certain types of glassware that I'm scared to use just because it seems like my wife wrote on Broad City, and so they gave her like a Broad City glass, and I'm scared to drink out of it because I'm like, what if this shatters? And it's just a Broad City glass. We can always buy it.
Right.
I'm sure the merch is still out there, but I can't imagine, is there anything in your head, when you're like, this is a piece of art I'm eating off of?
Well, when I was a kid, it didn't really occur to me because I didn't know the value of it. And I just, maybe to a certain degree thought everybody's grandfathers, made their, the plates and bowls and things that they ate off of. And it was just everywhere. And I have a bunch of it now. And of course it's like one of a kind pottery made by these guys in the 40s. Like, it is super valuable, not only from like a family history standpoint, but also, it from like a ceramics history. Like, these are kind of, to a certain degree, kind of important pieces. But my grandfather's thing all along was, forget about that. You should be eating off of them, So I try to keep his voice in my mind whenever we like bust out the big, the big buffet plate for, Thanksgiving or something like that. We don't eat off it all the time. It's for special occasions. And we do have a couple of his pieces hanging on the wall, which I think he would be opposed to. But so, and also my grandfather was kind of an eccentric, I think, as I come to find out. When I knew him, he was pretty old, and was, spent most of his time watching baseball on TV, and then near the end of his life really got into writing memoir, like his memoirs are just stories from the family. But I sort of have cobbled together his history, where he was kind of an eccentric, and he was into pottery. He had done theater early on. He played guitar, folk songs and folk singing was really important in the family. And also like built a observatory, like with a telescope on top of the garage that I always remember seeing as a kid. It was totally defunct. Nobody was using it, but there was this weird dome on top of the garage that I came to find out that he had built as like a makeshift observatory, like for looking at the stars.
Was the telescope still there?
I don't think the telescope was still there, but none of us were allowed up there because I think it was really dangerous. Like, it wasn't built very well. So that was kind of the spirit of that family, I think, to a certain degree. But I will also say you wouldn't know that, because I also feel like my grandfather was also a judge. And my father was a lawyer, and my uncle was an attorney, and people worked for the state and for the county. And so none of them were working artists except for my great uncle. And he died in a train station in Westchester County, New York, when he was in his 40s. And I think that he served as a cautionary tale to the rest of the family, particularly my dad, who is the oldest sibling of 5 kids, that you should never, because since my uncle Hank was the only working artist among all these people who kind of dabbled in arts, that you should never do the art as a full-time thing. It should always be a hobby. And that was the thing that he instilled and really drove home for both my sister and I growing up. Anytime that we dabbled in the arts, he was supportive to a certain degree, but was always like, don't ever do it as your main gig. And I didn't associate those two things together until much later than my sister did, because it hung over me like a millstone. And the fact that I had all these aspirations as a kid to follow the arts, to do writing or to do music, and then never received full-throated support from my dad. And neither did my sister, Miley. And then we went on to be relatively successful in the arts. And Miley's thing has always been, well, I just think that, Hank, great uncle Hank, was the cautionary tale. Like, that's what happens if you become, a full-time artist.
There's a lot here. I want to go back.
I'm going to let my cat out.
I want to go back to your grandfather for a second. In your opinion, if you know this, do you think that art for him was something that just like, you have to have a normal job? I'm a judge.
Yeah.
This is what I do. This is what I want to do. And art is just something on the side. And it brings meaning or whatever, or it adds aesthetic value to life. I'm not going to figure out exactly what he thought, but something like that, right? Or was it, I'd like to be an artist, but I don't think it's realistic, so I'm going to be a judge?
That I don't really know, because I don't think he was ever that forthcoming about it. I think my instinct is that he just probably didn't feel like he had the stuff to hack it, and I don't, and also the environment was so different. He's living in Helena, Montana in the mid-century. He's got a big family. I just don't think that it was practical to do what his brother was doing, and his brother was childless. And so I think they were just two different paths that they chose. And I don't think it would have been realistic for my grandfather to pursue art, because I think that while he was talented and the pottery that he threw and the pieces that he made are great, I think he always knew that Hank was the real talent among the two of them, and Hank really went for it,
Ooh. Sorry, in my mind, that's somewhat heavy knowledge to have, is to have like a sibling, like to maybe have some secret desire in your heart, and to eat. Well, okay, it could be that you have this self knowledge. Like I know that I'm not a good actor, so I have the self knowledge. Like that's not my path, right? My path is writing and other things. Just because, I don't think it would take a lot of work to be a good actor for me.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know. Just like that like, I don't know what that desire. Like sometimes I just think about the desire in people's hearts. Like, is it something that like weighs on them, or does it like illuminate? You're like, you know what? That's just not my path, and I'm going to do something else.
No. I mean, at least not in family lore. Or was there any indication from him that he was envious or resentful of Hank? I can't speak for him, and at least when I knew him, he wasn't very forthcoming. A typical, male of that generation wasn't about to open up, certainly to his grandchildren, about stuff like that,
Of course.
And so I think that their roles were, I think they were hugely supportive, because his sister Caroline was also fairly cosmopolitan, and she lived in New York for a little bit too. I think that they all just looked to Hank as being like, he's the guy, he has all the talent, and I think they admired him and loved him for it, and in some ways made it possible for him to do what he did, because he would come back to Montana in the summers and would spend time, on the family farm and with Pete, his brother, my grandfather, and they were close. And I think it was just a dynamic that was organic and made sense. Of course, and so then when it turned out so poorly, I mean, I don't know what was success. I mean, he was teaching at Columbia, and he was kind of, rubbing shoulders with some of the great mid-century painters of the time. I think he still was sort of emblematic of what a struggling artist was, and the fact that he died, he had a heart condition, and he died, alone in a train station in Westchester, became this sort of the story, Though, I mean, I think his life is super fascinating, and he traveled a lot, and he was sort of the main portrait artist for this woman, Catherine Cornell, who was kind of a star, a Broadway star, and he was constantly, and he would travel with her sometimes and would do her portrait for various things. He's sort of her favorite portrait artist, and
it's he also 17th century almost.
Yeah, and then and her understudy, this woman Ruth, he had an affair. He fell in love with, and even though she was married and had kids, they kind of ran off together. I think it's a very fascinating story, a very a rich life that he led. And so it's always kind of a bummer to me that what my dad drew away from that was like, don't live like Hank.
Yeah, especially because it doesn't seem like it was this isn't like a Greek tragedy. It's not like following the arts is what he died from, right? It's that he just happened to have a heart condition.
Yeah, but I also think that I think he was a struggling, I think he taught at Columbia, and I think it probably made ends meet, but he wasn't necessarily hugely successful in his field. Even though the work that he created was really good. And interesting, like my dad is the guy who's sort of carrying on his legacy, in that he's kind of controlling and deciding what to do with all the existing, like the body of work that he made, all his paintings and drawings and things. But so I don't know. I mean, I think that's my sister's interpretation of it, was that I think my dad saw what happened to Hank, and even though that might have not been my grandfather's interpretation, it was like, this is what happens if you follow art.
I have no idea. I mean, this is not an answerable question, but I'm going to ask it anyway to see where it goes. Do you think your great uncle was happy with where he was, or was he ambitious? Was it that he wanted to be whatever de Kooning? I don't know, right?
Yeah.
Whatever painter at the time was the thing.
Yeah.
Is that what he wanted, or was he okay with his level?
That I don't know. I mean, I'd have to like dig into like his letters and stuff like that, and we do have a lot of that stuff. Though we have letters from Ruth, the woman that he was in love with. I don't think that Ruth ever kept his letters. When we have a ton of insight into whether or not he was content or happy. And honestly, I don't know that his relative poverty had anything to do with his heart condition or how he ended up, but I think that's how it was interpreted.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, because I'm curious how this feels to you as a child or as a teenager, or whenever you're kind of like starting to understand the roles of your parents and your grandparents and your great uncle and everyone, you know, do you like, is there regret that you feel? Is there, you're like, oh, he pursued what he wanted and he did it and he was doing it and that's what matters? Or does it start some kind of burning ambition? Because there's, you know, I mean, I live in Los Angeles. I meet people who are untalented and have ambition, like burning ambition, and it takes them far. I meet plenty of people who are talented but don't have ambition. You know, hopefully, you know, the good people do have some kind of ambition and can get far. You know, I'm just curious at how this appears to you when you are growing up.
You know, I thought it was so cool, like that we had a painter in the family, not only a painter, but somebody who had really devoted his life to it and had chosen to live single or not have children, who had left Montana and lived in New York, you know, and was also painting commercially when he had to pay bills. But a lot of the stuff that he was doing at the end of his life was really bizarre, you know, very abstract expressionist stuff. And that always seemed, particularly as I got older, like that looked cool. And to a certain degree, the fact that he died, you know, I think at a young age, it's like as a young romantic, the idea of the struggling artist took hold in me, and that idea of sacrificing yourself for this, you know, this desire to make things as a way to try to figure out where you stand in the world and what is your relationship to other people and what are their relationships to you and their relationship to the world, like all those unknowable things, is that you would devote your life to that. And so despite, I think, my dad's, you know, takeaway from Hank's story, I found it resonant, like it seemed powerful to me. And I think probably, you know, made me want to go all in, you know, and because I didn't care. I was prepared to live in poverty. I was, at least then, you know, of course, looking back on it now, it's like, Jesus Christ, thank God it kind of worked out, because, you know, it's all well and good to be 17 and to be like, I don't fucking care, and I'm just going to be an artist, and if I live in poverty, so be it. You know, very different. And you're on the other end of 40. It's like, well, God, thank God that worked out, because I would be a little bit annoyed, I think, with my 17-year-old self had it not worked out. But that's kind of my boring practical adultness coming through. But yeah, I think I didn't care. I felt so passionate. I mean, for one thing, I felt like it was the only thing I could do. I felt like I was such a failure in everything else that I turned my hand to, which probably had a lot to do with my own, perception of myself and a lot of, baggage that I had as a kid. I think I felt like I had an understanding that I could do these things. I could write stories, and eventually I could write songs. But I think it started out with like, I know what's good music and what is bad music, those sort of kernels were enough to make me feel like this is the only thing I can do. I've tried anything else I try doesn't work out. I should just go all in on this.
Okay, there's a couple things here that I'm curious about. I was always buried by my parents' desires for what they wanted for me. It took a long time to dig myself out from underneath them.
Yeah.
And it seems like your dad had something particular, but at the very least, he didn't want you to do this.
He knew what he didn't want us to do.
Yeah. And I'm curious how heavy his desires for you weighed.
I think pretty heavily. I mean, I think, at least my understanding, my read on the situation is that I pretty quickly disappointed any aspirations that my dad might have. My dad was a sporty guy, and I think it became pretty clear at a young age that I was not going to be a sporty kid. And I think that was, and then at that point, I didn't necessarily excel in things that I think I don't even know what he expected from me. That's another thing. We may be from different, I think there's also been a shift in relationship between parents and kids. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, there's a lot more of a hands-off approach than I think, like, the sort of millennial generation. And I think that also, I don't know that there were that many expectations of what I was going to do. I think or at least it became clear early on, I wasn't going to like take over the law firm or anything like that. And so I don't know that I was under any kind of weight of parental expectations, because I think I dashed those expectations at a very young age.
Did you feel it at the time? Like the minute your dad wanted you to play baseball or something like that, like Little League or something like that, and you weren't very good.
Yeah.
Could you feel like the?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Well, my dad, he later became a soccer coach, but he was a really competitive dude. And I don't remember this, but he was a soccer dad, and I was in the soccer program at YMCA or whatever. And I always liked being the defender, being a fullback, because you didn't have to run as much. And most of the action happened on the other end of the field. And half of the game, you could just kind of hang out. And there are stories of friends of my parents who would see me just like kind of sitting on the grass, looking at leaves of grass while the ball goes whizzing by, kind of thing, with my dad like screaming from the sidelines for me to keep my eye on the ball, kind of thing. So yeah, that was definitely a thing, and I think there was a big effort on his part to try to get me through that, and trying to instill in me the importance of team sports. But I think I've always just been the sort of person that's just I don't adapt to something that I'm not fit to do. I just I am drawn to the things that I want to do and do best. I'm not very malleable in that sense. And I think my dad realized that pretty early on.
Yeah. Well, there's a world where you want his approval so much that you dedicate yourself to that, right?
Yeah.
So there has to be there's enough of a differentiation between the two of you and enough of a sense of self, it seems, where you're like, look, this is not for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he really fought that, and we were, particularly in my teenage years, we were at loggerheads a lot. It was not an easy relationship, and it wasn't until I left home and was really independent that I think our relationship kind of mended. But I do think it was the opposite. I in some ways was driven to prove him wrong, to be like, fuck you. No, I can make it in the arts, and I'm going to make it be the thing. It's not going to be a hobby. It's going to be the thing I focus on. And if I'm not doing writing, I'm going to be in a band. And I think that was a driving force for me. In some ways, maybe I do owe, my success to a certain degree to my dad, because I was so intent on proving him wrong. And when I did, it was like, mwah! It was such sweet revenge. And of course he's proud, and he is like the proudest dad and comes to all the shows. And even though I've kind of thrown him under the bus over and over again in the songs even, and do these kind of interviews where I kind of frankly talk about our relationship and how, I was supported as a kid. I think that he has a sense of humor about it. He gets it. He gets the irony of it, particularly also that my sister Miley became a novelist. So a successful novelist, so, of course, I'm sure he was happy to be proven wrong.
Yeah. Well, you were a teenager. I mean, we're describing a relationship, in the, 30 years ago or so, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can't be totally held responsible for how you, I clash with my dad all the time,
No. Yeah. And I think to give him credit, I think it's totally reasonable
100%
to talk to your kids and be like, you probably shouldn't do the arts as a full-time gig, because it's more than likely going to end in heartbreak and poverty, because that is statistically, that's the truth. I wish that he had seen a glimmer of talent in me that would have made him think, actually, no, I think you're going to be all right. But maybe I didn't show that. Maybe the talent wasn't there yet. Maybe he couldn't see it. Thankfully, I did have people like my grandmother, my mom's mom. I remember always like a very Catholic, woman, and grew up in Southern California. Roman Catholic to the core, would tell me, God has given you a gift. And even though as a kid I was such like a little atheist, it was really great. It was powerful to hear that, because she was really the only person in my life who, unadorned, would tell me that, And I think she was a grandparent, so she had a little bit extra distance. She didn't have to deal with the blowback of, blowing up my ego or anything like that. She got to just see me, in the summer and sometimes Christmas or something, and tell me, God has given you a gift. See my but she saw the short stories I was writing and the plays I was writing in elementary school, and would tell me that, and that was a really powerful thing.
Is there something, as a parenthetical, whether someone succeeds or not is almost entirely luck, right?
Yeah.
There is just it either catches the zeitgeist or it doesn't. Just because I say that just because there are so many talented people I see around me, some peers who just are struggling, and so it's just okay, I think I see the dynamics of this, and I'm wondering, was there because part of it then is this kind of pushback against your dad, I'll show you, you're shaking your fist. Do you remember something early on in your life, teenager, maybe early years of playing music or something, whatever, where it was the determination that pushed you through? Does that make sense as a question?
Oh, like in adversity and pushing through.
Where you're, because I think that I'll show you is the resentment of that is a powerful emotion that can really push you through certain times till you work hard enough. Because I'm assuming, from what it seems from your songs, from your music, in my mind, you are someone who sits there and works on your craft a long time and figures things out. So I would think that to get to that point where you are really, it takes a while. And I'm wondering, in those early years, what is the emotional, what is in you that's like pushing you through? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is ignoring the adversity to a certain degree, and being oblivious of it. And I feel like my early years of learning to write songs and to learn to play an instrument, if we talk about music, I think I was doing it. Well, for one thing, it was fun. I mean, it was just, it spoke to, it was the thing I most wanted to do and most look forward to. And for one thing, writing and playing music on my own was like a compulsive thing. It was something I just wanted to do in my free time. But then also playing with other people in my first bands and things like that, where it was just something that I couldn't wait for that practice day, I loved when we were able to, because I was in this guy, David, who was the son of my guitar teacher. He and I started playing music together and when I was in high school, and he had a mixing board, and that's all you needed. You could just run all the channels into the tape deck, and you could record what you were doing. And he even had like reverb pedals because his dad worked at a music shop and was a guitar teacher, so he had gear, and it was so cool. And to record yourself and to listen to it back, it was just magical. It was so that I would think less adversity and more just like this was my joy, this was my love. And then, once you start playing in a band and there are, you hear about people not liking your band or that kind of adversity, and then you just push through it. I think the power of the love for it is always greater than, whatever criticism you might be getting, and a certain amount of certainty. Well, like, they might be criticizing what I'm doing, but actually they don't know. They don't get it. I'm doing what we're doing is good. And so we're just going to continue doing that. It's just that knowing, that internal knowing of what you're doing is at least good, if not, great.
Yeah, I get it. Sorry, when you were talking, I'm thinking about myself, and I'm just like, yeah, I guess I'm like 75%, 80% love and 20% resentment. I guess there is resentment in there, but it's not overpowering. I'm like, oh, right, I do love what I do. Right.
Yeah, I don't think I was, maybe I was, writing songs in my bedroom because I wanted to show my dad wrong. I think it was later on, after college, when I was, starting to think about really going for it, was when that adversity, I think, probably really drove me on to a certain degree.
When you said that you tried other things, do you mean that you tried other things like, oh, there's stuff I might like to do with my life, and I'm gonna, do science fair and see if that works out? Or is it just that like it just happened that you weren't interested in these other things, so you didn't?
I just channeled all my love into that. I was the kid on the report cards and, parent teacher conferences, it was always, Colin is great at doing the things that he is interested in doing, and he's really bad at the things that aren't preferred activities, And I like math and science, those, gym, phys ed, whatever, like those were things that I didn't like doing. I didn't find them. I really needed to find magic in something to want to do it. And so that inevitably made me like turning, math story problems into these, epic stories. It's just like trying to find my way into it to make it interesting. So it wasn't necessarily that I was searching around for the thing that spoke to me. It was like, it was clear pretty early on where my interests were, and I was drawn to them like the moth to the flame.
Do you remember an early, doesn't have to be the first necessarily, but just something early in your life where it drew you in like that, a story or a piece of music or something?
Yeah. Well, with writing, I remember, I have a distinct memory of being given an assignment in first grade. So whatever, I was 7, 8, and being given our first assignment to write a story. And, it was like a construction paper affair that, you were turning into a kind of a book. And so there was drawings, but then there was also writing. And it was a story called The Blizzard Monster, about a family that is like attacked by a monster that arrives out of a blizzard. And I actually don't remember what happens, but I do remember writing it and feeling like I had really cracked something open inside me, that like it was super fun to live in this world in which this family was attacked by a blizzard monster, and then the process of putting it together into a book so then it was a physical thing that you could look at and you could read. And then also, I think a big part of it was the fact that I also, when I showed it to grownups, they were like, wow, this is really great. And everybody seemed excited about it. So those things mixed together, I think, sent me on the path. And then, in second grade, I wrote a play. So it was the next year. I think I just really got excited about this writing thing. And I wrote a play called The Bloody Night that was about a castle in the woods, and there's a ghost in the woods that's killing all of the knights, and they keep sending knights out to try to defeat the ghost. But the ghost, in the end, even kills like it's sort of a bloodbath, like a Shakespearean bloodbath.
I was gonna say, very Macbeth.
And it was second grade, and thankfully I had my teacher, I think, was really supportive and allowed me to leave, to go in during recess time and rehearse it with my friends who I had cast in it. And we ended up like showing it to the entire school, like had a day where we were set up in the cafeteria and different classes came in to watch the play. It's an extraordinary thing. Not only that they didn't like flag this for potentially, deviant behavior, like violent early psychopathy or something, but the fact that they were just like, let the whole class, the whole school should see this, which was very formative, I think.
What is Reagan era Helena like?
Right. Well, I think it was very different than it is now. The culture wars, I think, and what the Republican Party turned into has destroyed, I think, a spirit in Montana that was there, where there was a certain amount of live and let live, and while it was certainly more conservative, but that conservatism was a lot more around conservationism, very protective of Montana, very Montana-centered, very wary of outsiders, people who weren't native to Montana, native, quote unquote. And that, I guess you would sort of like frontier spirit, quote unquote, like these people, like I think it was just, there wasn't so many labels attached, MAGA, wokeness, like all the stuff that I think has really destroyed the community fabric of Montana, as it has the entire country. But there was a really live and let live sort of attitude, I think, in Montana, and I think that there was a lot of hands off. Parents. Like I rode my bike everywhere, did not wear helmets. You were kind of let to do your own thing, and you were supported, and you were, in that. And And I think that existed in the school districts as well. I think that kids were allowed to kind of do their own thing to a certain degree. At least that was my experience.
Because I'm trying to figure out, it seems like the school supported you. It seems like your grandmother supported you. It seems, I think about humans in certain terms reductively as a series of vectors, and like what's pushing and pulling on you and pushing you in certain directions. Because if this was like a deep desire from early on in your life, I also I had a deep desire to do this, and I just didn't know I had a deep desire to do this, and it took me a long time. And so when I talk to people who figured it out early and then went after it, I'm always really, I guess, baffled. I guess that's why I'm just like, so what was that like? Because there was nothing else that there was no like force pushing on you. I guess besides your dad, that was just like, no, you gotta.
That was the adversarial force.
You got to be a lawyer. You got to be whatever. Like you don't even have to be a lawyer, but you got to be a teacher. You got to be something practical.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. The flip side of it is my wife's experience, where her parents were super supportive of her art. She's an illustrator and an artist, and they were very supportive, and they loved her, and they hung it on the wall, and they wanted her to pursue the arts. Like, this is what you should do. And even like her younger sister, who didn't have as much of a proclivity for art, they were always like, don't you want to get into art? Like maybe you shouldn't go to Columbia. Maybe you should go travel around a little bit and, search, And I think Carson's sister has always felt a little, like, why, if this is the very opposite of my experience, where like, God, if I had only had a little bit more of that, of my parent. But maybe that's the thing. Like, I think she ended up resenting that. And, we would go back to her, like early on in a relationship, going back to her childhood home and seeing all this stuff on the walls. And she would be so embarrassed, like, oh my God, you guys, can you take this stuff down? But I was like, oh my, this is amazing. Like, if I had just had a little bit of this, what difference would that have made? But then maybe, I think it didn't necessarily help Carson in something, and to a certain degree, I think it was something that she was working against.
Were there any practical steps that you started to take where you're like, okay, if this is what I want to do, I'm gonna go to college and study X, or I'm going to, I think if I had really, and my life would have been very different. I don't even know. But like, if I really had known what I wanted to do, I would have skipped college, gone right to New York.
Yeah.
And I would have ended up there at like the early days of UCB. And, but I didn't know that. So I ended up there like, post Bobby Moynihan on SNL. And, it's kind of like it's calcified at that point. I guess I'm trying to figure out is like, what did you actually like do to pursue this?
Well, I didn't think, I wasn't sure about music. I thought, even in my own, I'm going to be a starving artist thing, I wasn't prepared to dive into just doing music. And I knew people out of high school who had moved to Seattle, and were working in restaurants and trying to play in bands and things like that. And I remember going and visiting them and being like, ugh, this seems really depressing, guys. I don't know if I could do this. And at that time, I think music and writing were two genuinely like equal passions of mine. And so I guess I chose pursuing an English degree over, ditching college, because I think there was a certain amount of family expectation, like you should go to college. And I was drawn to it too. I was drawn to that, the sort of the academic environment, and wanted to pursue English. Of course, I started doing theater when I was in college, and that threatened to kind of take over briefly until I kind of was like, no, I'm not going to do this.
What was that moment? Do you mind if I ask? Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, I think you talk a lot about people who have a ton of ambition but not a lot of talent. I mean, I think being in the theater program, I was at University of Oregon, an English major, and I showed up, at the theater during the first week of classes, and they do a kind of orientation and try to get people into the theater program. And since I had done theater in high school at the community theater, I was like taken up, the flies, the smell of the stage and the paint and all this stuff, and was just like, I got to do this again, and started taking a ton of theater classes and and like my work study program was in the theater, and started to get more serious about theater than I was about my English classes, and even did a study abroad in England where we were studying theater. And I was surrounded, and as you are, in theater classes, you're surrounded by people who everybody is equally ambitious, and it's a very particular kind of ambition, very different from English creative writing workshops, playing in bands, other kind of arts. Like, it has its own. Everybody's kind of trying to outshow everybody else, and I think at a certain point I could see other people in my classes who were, planning on going to LA or New York after they graduated and making a go of it. And I was like, I don't know if that's going to work out for you, but you clearly don't see that, And I started to think, even though I was getting cast and stuff, and I was doing a lot of work, and I was kind of hanging in there with the best of them, at the end of the day, I was like, I had a realization that I might have what it takes to cut it at the University of Oregon theater department, but like being an actor in New York or LA, I knew at a certain point that I didn't have what it takes, and so moved out of that and back into writing.
Was that a reckoning? Like, did it hit you hard, or was it just I know, okay, I get it. I get this about myself.
No, it didn't hit me hard. I think it was a gradual thing. And I also think it was just a certain amount of like burnout about being in that crowd too. And I ended up going back to University of Montana. I don't know. It was a bunch of things. And I think I'd gone too deep with theater and was like, this is not my path. And I don't think it wasn't like an overnight thing. It was a gradual thing. And of course that was also a decision because it was, expensive to be going to an out-of-state school, and I didn't have a ton of money. And so going to University of Montana made more sense. It had a creative writing program, and I just felt like I was drifting off my path, and I need to reorient myself towards writing, which is what I did by going back to U of M and going into the writing program.
Was it really that like conscious? Like, did you have those conscious thoughts? I don't know if you can remember, but like, because it seems like you, like, since you were a kid, you were very self-aware of your emotions, of your desires. And so it seems like at that point that would be just like I use myself as an as like just the sounding board inserts. That's because I was too sensitive as a kid, and at some point my body just like shut down because it was I was feeling everything too much.
Yeah, huh.
And so the way that you're telling the story, it seems to me that you always kind of just like had some kind of self-knowledge about yourself, that there wasn't like. It wasn't just something you had to like kind of like figure out, or you had to figure it out, but you could figure it out intellectually. It wasn't just something that was thrust upon you.
Well, I mean, I don't really distinguish that drive, that desire. Between writing and music, I think they satisfy the same core thing. And at a certain point, theater also did that. So I don't think it's necessarily that the thing inside me, the core thing, changed. It's just finding the avenue that expressed it, And I think that did require a certain amount of searching around, And initially it was writing, and then I fell in love with music, and then I went back to writing, and then it was theater for a second, but then back to writing, and then, living in Portland to get my life experience before I went back, what I thought for my MFA in creative writing, where I would either teach writing or teach English, be an academic, is when I started the Decemberists. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, okay, I guess music is the thing. But thankfully I was able, given the opportunity, to also go back to writing.
But you were never embarrassed about your emotions. Question.
I don't. Wow. I don't know that. I mean, I was raised. I think my mom. I was raised by a very open, emotional mother who just let it all hang out, for better or worse. I was part of the free to be you and me generation. I don't know if that is a reference you get, but It's All Right to Cry, was like the soundtrack of my childhood. I was given all kinds of license to show my emotion, which I think is because my parents, my mom and dad's generation, was a reaction to their, to the older generation, particularly my mom, just being like, don't bottle it up, let it all hang out, which I think was a guiding principle, certainly as a kid.
Yeah, because I think to do theater, to do why I'm a shitty actor is because I'm embarrassed about my emotions, right? I can't I've been in therapy for a decade.
Yeah, you need to. That's something you'll need to process.
So no. I mean, I can
professional.
I can do it in person. I can do it. There's something though when it's when the camera's on me, that where it's just I can tell a joke. I can, I could deliver a joke in a sitcom or something like that. But anything deeper than that, I get, it feels like a force field, right? And in my personal life, I've broken through that, and I think to be a good writer, which I have become, and to be a good partner and a good friend, I've broken through that.
Yeah.
But there's something, so that's why I asked, to theater, and I think in your music, the way that you sing, it feels full and emotive.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm like, oh, so you have to have embraced that at some point in your life. And it seems
I'm also a deeply guarded person too. I mean, I think that's the paradox, is that I think in some ways that I'm absolutely terrified about what other people think of me. And that have been, carried through life with that fear. But there is something in that, in the expression, in writing and in doing music that it breaks me free of that. That's the only place where I have no control over and can only just do the thing that I do, and it is very liberating. And of course, as soon as I close my mouth from singing or walk off stage or, finish my writing, then I just seize up.
Did you feel that liberation early on? Do you think that's something that once you discovered that freedom, that was the thing that really pulled you?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah. I mean, I think, and I think being in theater was a big part of that too, doing musical theater, doing community theater in Helena, doing theater school there. And there's a summer theater school program that my parents, when I was, 15, that I got into. And I was a very kind of shy and kind of closed up person prior to that. And I had to be on stage. I actually had to sing a Michael Jackson song. I was in this very short piece, and I was the president. And it was written by the director of this very short scene. It was at the end of a 2-week, theater camp, and I had to get on stage and sing "Man in the Mirror," and having never sung on stage before or really been on stage acting before. And it was this insane trial by fire that I do remember a breaking point where I, before walking on stage in front of, the people, my parents and the community that had shown up to see this showcase at the end of this theater camp, that I was just like, I just have to go out and do it. There's just nothing. I just have to do it. And I did it. And it was this huge, even though I'm sure it was awful and embarrassing and cringy, but he's like, I just need to go out and do it. And I think that is once I kind of connected with that, it has made performing and being in playing music and performing in music be an incredibly, transformative experience every time I do it.
That actually seems like a nice place to end.
Yeah.
Colin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, my
absolute
pleasure.
Delight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was quite a really kind of dug down there deep, didn't we?
Yeah. I mean, this is a huge pleasure for me. I remember seeing you play a small coffee house in Pittsburgh like decades ago.
Oh, all right.
That's when I fell in love. So
Cool.
Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time. Bye. Bye, oh, 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 bye.